Good day, ladies and gentlemen, teachers, educators, leaders. Welcome to Leader Chat. I am Jeff Rose. This conversation that we're going to have today has been one that we've been planning for a while. As you know, if you listen and follow us, and of course, I want to remind our listeners and followers, of course, to follow, subscribe, give us feedback. That's always important to us. So that's our plug there. But we tend to schedule these leader chats not too far in advance because we want them to be somewhat organic and tied to some of the challenges and opportunities that are being experienced in the educational world from a leadership perspective, and we want to make it current. But this is one that we knew would be, and it's not because of the week that we're actually recording this. So for the audience to know, we're recording this on a Friday, and we've had a very busy, chaotic week because the presidential election was this week, just a few nights ago. And so the fact that we are talking, yes, with Amanda Ripley, specific about conflict and leading beyond and through conflict was planned, perfect timing. Cognia is politically agnostic as a nonprofit education organization, the largest in the world, actually. However, we do know that politics create these ripples of challenges and emotions amongst people. So we are thrilled that Amanda Ripley is going to be here with us today. Let me tell you a quick bit about her. Remind you that if you did not know this, 3 years ago, we talked with Amanda Ripley about high conflict, 2021, almost 3 years ago to the T. So much has happened in 3 years. And by the way, conflict has continued to be, let's just say, ongoing and turbulent. So Amanda Ripley is a New York Times bestselling author, a Washington Post contributing columnist, and the co-founder of Good Conflict, a media and training company that helps people reimagine conflict. She has written 3 award-winning nonfiction books about 3 very different subjects: high conflict, the smartest kids in the world, and the unthinkable. Her most recent book, High Conflict, which chronicles how people get trapped by conflict of all kinds and how they get out. Her previous books include The Unthinkable, which was published in 15 countries and turned into a PBS documentary, and Smartest Kids in the World, as I described earlier, a New York Times bestseller, which also inspired a documentary film. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, Slate, the Harvard Business Review, and the Times of London. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me invite Amanda to the screen. Amanda, 3 years ago. Wow. Catch us up. How have you been?
It's good to see you, Jeff. Thanks for having me back. Congratulations on getting to 100 episodes. That's a lot of conversations and preparation and booking and hard work. So in 3 years, well, let's see. Since we last spoke, I did something I've never done before. Usually I write books and then that's kind of it. I move on to the next subject. I write magazine articles. But in this case, I got a lot of demand from people reaching out saying, okay, thanks for the book. Nice stories. But
Yes.
what do we do with this? Like how, now that we've seen stories of people who've been trapped in really dysfunctional and even violent conflict, get out of that conflict, how do we operationalize this in our own lives? And my first reaction was, I don't know. That's not what I do. I'm a journalist, But luckily, I have a colleague named Helene Bianduti-Hofer, who is a broadcast journalist and conflict mediator as well. And she had done a lot of teaching in the past as well. So she said, you know what? I think we can be helpful to people here. And so we created a workshop for journalists at first to help them cover conflict differently. And that was an incredible experience. And we got a lot of, really, really fascinating and hopeful experiences working with journalists. And then we started hearing from non-journalists. So we created a workshop for them to help them deal with really sudden, difficult conflict and taking everything we'd learned from covering conflict, but also from studying and learning from experts in conflict and trying to turn it into, actual frameworks and rituals and guardrails for people to use in the real world. So we've been doing that for 3 years, and it's been an incredible journey.
So as you're working with, I have to assume, a variety of entities, because I can't imagine, an entity or a corporation or a particular discipline who isn't navigating conflict in some way, shape, or form to probably different intensities, different strategies. Have you seen, do you see trends as it relates to the kinds of organizations or groups that are calling and requesting your support?
Yeah, because it's interesting actually, because we didn't do any marketing, right? So it was all kind of organic, who is finding us. And I will tell you, we heard from all kinds of folks, from, evangelical ministers to rabbis to lawyers to politicians and their staff. But I'll let you guess the number one industry that we heard from more frequently than any other.
Oh,
What
I
do you
mean,
think it is?
ours, right? Is it
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, we
of
heard from a
course.
lot of educators, so school superintendents, school leaders, school board members, and also university higher ed leaders. So that far and away has been the group of people that has reached out to us the most. And we've learned a lot from working with those folks because, who is trained for this level of conflict? Like nobody. And it's not, shouldn't be part of their jobs, but it is and has become part of their jobs to be extremely savvy about conflict so that they can use it to their advantage rather than getting totally burned out by it.
So since our conversation 3 years ago, and I'll remind those that haven't listened, and if you have, I request you do. I read High Conflict because I was curious. I did not read it because I was preparing for our conversation. And it was after that, after reading it, based upon a recommendation from a friend, I thought, we need to invite Amanda Ripley. I mean, this is so relevant, her content into the kind of that leadership realm for schools and districts and so forth. So apparently, I was right. Maybe even ahead of the curve, right? Because if you continue to hear from organizations, conflict creates an incredible target amongst, in the educational system. But how do you stay? Is it hard to stay motivated and enthusiastic, and there's so much conflict? So, what is your personal strategy on staying positive? Because you probably see a lot of challenge and pain along the way.
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that because when I was covering conflict as a journalist, when I was covering everything from, terrorism to disasters to education, um, I did find the conflict really draining after a while. It was just really hard to just keep hearing the same different, every story is different, right? But the same patterns of, loss or grief or blame. I will say since doing this training work and trying to cover conflict differently, that is also part of what I've been doing. I find that much more energizing in a way. I haven't gotten burned out yet. That could, check with me tomorrow. But for today, I think the thing that energizes me the most is when we are able to find and spotlight outlier stories. So people who are managing to create functional conflict instead of dysfunctional conflict, people who are finding ways to interrupt dysfunctional conflict. Those stories are fascinating because they're really like, they're like mystery novels trying to figure out. Let me give you a quick example. This is
Yeah.
by a colleague and friend named Courtney Martin, who wrote a piece for the Christian Science Monitor a while back about a town in Ohio that almost imploded in school board conflict over how to teach America's racial history and then didn't. Right. So the whole story is like, what happened here? What did this superintendent do? Who did he ask for help from? What was he about to do? And then he stopped himself. And that's just great storytelling and also useful, right? Because then you can start to see a playbook emerge once you get more and more of those stories. So that I find really energizing.
So I'm curious, as you clearly described, that a lot of work or people reaching out to you happen to be from the kind of educational realm. Why education? I mean, I have my own theories around that, but that's not my work predominantly like it is yours. So why do you think educational leaders face in this polarized climate? Like, what do you predict changes in the future? Do you think it's going to stay the same? And then, I'm just curious, as you're going, are you seeing more examples on better ways that educational leaders are handling it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think you and your listeners all have some ideas about why education is so combustible, right? And that was true, even before the pandemic. But I think the pandemic really frayed what was left of social trust in one another, but also in schools, in particular, K through 12 schools in a lot of places. And so you take a low trust environment and then you add that searing experience. And then, of course, most people in most parts of the US have not really had the opportunity or willingness to grieve and process what happened during the pandemic. And it got so politicized that it's hard to even talk about and do a clear kind of fact-finding analysis of what went right and what went wrong, the way we did after 9/11. So, you have all this unprocessed anger and frustration and grief and blame and trauma in some cases. So I think that combination is extremely corrosive, and I think your listeners probably all know that. So I won't dwell on it, except to say that the low trust environment preceded the pandemic, and there were lots of reasons for that, right? But when I worked on The Smartest Kids in the World, my book about what it's like to be a kid in other higher performing countries, what I noticed is that the kids in those countries seemed to buy into school. Like, they believed in the rhetoric. I mean, I'm generalizing, right? But
Sure.
I followed American teenagers in these countries, in Korea, Finland, and Poland. And that's what the American kids noticed, is like, they're taking school seriously. And then the question was, why? Why are they taking it seriously? And the theory that I came up with, which is a theory, right? It's very hard to prove. But the theory I came up with based on all the research and everything I saw in those countries is that they took school more seriously because it was more serious, and the culture and society sent a bunch of signals that this was difficult, important work, particularly the work of teaching, but also the work of learning, right? So there was a kind of status associated with teaching and learning for different reasons in different countries, right? Like, the story behind that is important and different in different places, but there was a way in which they were walking the walk around school being important. And I think, unfortunately, in the US, kids, certainly by middle school, pick up on signals in a lot of our schools, not all, right? But in a lot of our schools, that suggest that we say one thing and do another, right? So we say that school is super important and that we believe in rigorous learning and that it will lead you to a better life, but we don't select, train, or support our teachers that way, typically, right? Let alone pay them that way. Now, in Washington, D.C., where I live, we do pay our teachers pretty well now, and that's not one of the reasons that they leave when they leave the profession. But then other ways we don't support them. So there isn't a kind of reverence for the profession, nor an understanding of what it looks like at its best that you would see in some countries. So that's a long-winded answer, but I think it's important to note that the trust problem predates our current political polarization and the pandemic.
So the trust problem, I think, is accurate, and we have also faced these polarizing times in our country's history in the past as well. That said, the way that politics has seeped into the work of leading schools, specifically with school boards, superintendents,
Yeah.
and how that trickles down to the schools, is much more intense than it's ever been. Right. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. I do think there's this eroding trust. And then what we experienced through the pandemic, there were people searching on how they make a dent based upon their philosophy. But we also see right now there's political playbooks that are clearly written as it relates to how they influence school districts, and whether that be through school boards, how you mobilize community, show up at board meetings. There are playbooks on how they do that on the right and left, and it is completely hijacked and in many ways distracted from our overall mission of why educators and leaders signed up to do what they do, right? And so you have these leaders who are finding themselves in arenas that they didn't necessarily think they were signing up for, looking around and realizing, oh, I'm in this arena. What do I do now? Right? Without necessarily past background, experience, nor training on navigating that level of political conflict when they're there to focus on the infrastructure of the schools and support students and community. So in that being the case, what advice do you have for leaders just to try to refocus their messaging on this is what we're here for? Let me remind us all that despite your opinions, that is not the job of the school system. How does one do that, of course, without being run out? What are your strategies for the leader?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what's interesting is I do agree that education has been hit particularly hard for lots of reasons, and we've only mentioned some of them here, but the experience of it, the patterns, the dynamics are not unique to education. So I see the same kind of dynamics happening in state, local, and federal politics. I see it happening in journalism. I see it happening in healthcare. They're nonprofits, I see a similar pattern. I think right now there's a lot of electricity in the air, and it's really easy to become a lightning rod, because that electricity is looking for a target, and you don't want to be that target. So some of what we do when we do workshops, we walk people through 4 steps. And a lot of what we're doing there is trying to help them avoid becoming the target, but also, if and when they do become the target, find ways to channel that energy, to use conflict to get stronger as a community, as an organization. This is possible, but the sooner you lay down some kind of foundation for that, the better it's going to go. So the steps we use, which are based mostly on what conflict mediators do and gang violence interrupters and other people who work in difficult conflict, the first step we do is to map the conflict. So literally get it out of your head and put it on paper, which is one way to get a little distance from it, because it's very hard not to take it personally when you're being attacked very personally, right, on social media or in school board meetings or whatever it is. And then that can help us kind of surface some opportunities that we maybe didn't see before. And the second thing we do is to investigate the understory of the conflict. So this is the idea, and this is my favorite step, by the way. This is the idea that every conflict has the thing it seems to be about, the thing that we are fighting about endlessly, whether it's, book bans or how to teach about racism. And then it has the thing it's really about underneath that, right? So the sooner you can get to that, what we call the understory, the thing it's really about, the better this fight is going to go. Because there is a fight you probably need to have, but you want to have the right fight. And right now, what we keep seeing is like a bunch of people having the wrong fight with the wrong people at the wrong time, which means they're never having the fight they actually need to have. So then the challenge becomes, how can we figure out what the understory is for you and for me more quickly, so we can at least have the right fight? And just quickly, there's usually only 4 understories. So that's the good news. There's only 4. And it's respect and recognition, power and control, care and concern, and then just stress and overwhelm, which is a big one, right, in education. But usually one of those 4 is at play, and it's really helpful to start to investigate which one. And we have different, tactical listening techniques and ways to help you do that. But that is really, really powerful. So you can figure out what we're fighting about.
So I want to make sure that I understand. So as you're engaging, and I do remember at times as a principal many years ago, that was a long time ago, where if a parent was upset, there were times I realized there's no way they're this upset over what they're telling me. There's something else, right? And then so I thought, well, my strategy is somehow to ask the right questions so that we could get to the root of the true dilemma to see whether we actually want to talk about that or not. Because at times it wasn't something that I was able to help or assist with. And at times it was. What I'm hearing you say is that the leader wants to start with how do we categorize according to these kind of 4 areas so that they know which strategy to attach it to. Because otherwise, the wrong strategy attached to the wrong problem, potential, combustion.
Exactly. And the key step that you mentioned from your work as a principal is asking questions and listening to the answers, right? So you're listening for clues. You're not listening to rebut or defend or argue at first, right? Like you're really trying to figure out like what is going on here. And like you said, sometimes it won't be something you'll be able to help with, probably most of the time, honestly. But half of what people want in this moment is to be heard. So can we show them that we are trying to understand them? Even if we totally disagree and we never change our path, right? We can show them we are listening, which is actually a huge act of grace and dignity that people are not getting enough of, right? So there is value in doing that. And then hopefully you can figure out what's really going on. So map the conflict, investigate the understory, and then you might need to have the right fight, right? That's the third step is like, okay, now how do we set up that difficult conversation? How do we issue the invitation? How do we kind of create the conditions for that to go a little better rather than terribly? And there's, some very basic tips and tricks around that, but the biggest one is to practice and really take it seriously, not improv. And the fourth step is to try to infuse the habits and rituals of healthy conflict into your team and your culture and your daily routines so that each subsequent conflict is easier and more useful, right? So if you can do that with your school board members or your parents or your teachers and just kind of have those things to go back to, then you're more likely to surface the conflict, figure out what it is faster, and deal with it or not without it metastasizing.
Can you go a little bit further into detail around that kind of infusing process? Because I think that's important for people to hear. At times, leaders feel, when number one, they feel the pressure of having to own the room they walk into, right? And sometimes be the one to help navigate and be the lightning rod. Even though they shouldn't, they sometimes feel pressure to stand up and do that, right? I mean, totally. I remember that. I mean, I used to almost actively volunteer. I'll take this, right?
Yeah. Like,
look, I would sometimes
hit me.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Like I would tell the board, look, this is going to create a lot of divisions. I think it makes sense. It's strategic for us to focus this problem at me, right? No, and I probably did that I wanted to be helpful and serve, and at times maybe it was driven by ego. Who knows? But I sometimes would subscribe to I'll be the lightning rod, which probably wasn't always the best strategy. So if you're going to infuse strategies beyond you as the leader, which I think is really wise, talk to us more about how that works or how you would recommend it work.
Yeah. So one thing that we have found is very effective is we train people to be 10% vulnerable. This is especially for leaders.
10%.
So 10%, not 100%, not 80%, 10%.
Oh, this is
and
good.
It's counter to your intuition, at least mine, right? When you're under attack and people are saying false things about you, your intuition, right, is to defend, to maybe go on the counterattack or try to avoid it, hope it goes away, right? Just like walk away, or try to find some way to prove the other person wrong, all of these things, right? But you eventually end up kind of becoming stoic and walling up, right? Because you never want to let them see you sweat, essentially, when you're under threat like that. And that's very understandable, very normal reaction. In high conflict, in an age like we're living in, you have to do counterintuitive things, which requires planning and practice. And one of those counterintuitive things, in our experience, that we have seen superintendents do with great effect, if they do it with care, is to be 10% vulnerable. So that might mean revealing that you are struggling with something, even revealing that you don't know the right answer. You know what you're going to do, but you're not 100% sure. You're hearing this and that, and also this third thing. Even revealing if you're losing sleep at night about something, saying that to the teacher union leader or to the school board chair, whatever. The point is you're trying to rehumanize yourself so you're a little harder to dehumanize. And you are the best person to do that sometimes, and other times other people are the best people to do that, right? Like I get your inclination, and all great leaders do this. They want to be the lightning rod. Sometimes you're not the right lightning rod or the right messenger, and sort of noticing that. And that's one of the things we do in the mapping process is figure out like, maybe I'm not the one, or maybe I am, but really considering that in with clear eyes.
Well, it's funny. I think that sometimes it's the leader's intuition, regardless of kind of where that comes from, isn't necessarily the best strategy for the current and future tense, right? I think that there have been times in a leader's training or observations that they learn these behaviors, or they're ambitious and they do believe they have big shoulders and they can take it. And then therefore their intuition is maybe contrary to the strategy they should employ.
Yeah, right. Because it worked in the past.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
Doesn't
right.
mean it's going to work now, unfortunately. Right.
Exactly.
Like there's different rules of engagement right now. That is the number one takeaway. It's like things that served you in the past are not going to necessarily work. In fact, they can often make things worse. So quick example from that Courtney Martin story I told you about the Ohio town that didn't implode entirely in conflict. So one of the things that superintendent did, he started out like everybody else, defending himself, being the lightning rod, all those things. And after one really harrowing school board meeting, he was driving home and he said to himself, I think I need to shut up. I think I need to stop talking. And his name is Marlon Stiles, and he told Courtney, and also there's a podcast about this that I definitely recommend and can share a link with you later. But he said, maybe I need to find some trusted messengers. So he managed to reach out to some faith leaders in town who were trusted, who he knew, and he asked them to go to the school board meetings. And, he didn't tell them what to say, but he asked them to contribute, to say what they saw happening in the town, in the schools, what their hopes and fears were for the town, right? And he called them, this is my favorite part, he called them his positive gossipers, which I love.
Yeah.
And you look back at, conflict through going back thousands of years, humans need positive gossipers, right? Like it's these third parties who often it's elders or women or faith leaders, they take different forms. Former superintendents are great for this, but different people who are not directly in the line of fire, so to speak.
So it's interesting because I left my leadership post in 2019, and I work really hard. Despite having all this access and engagement with educational leaders all over the country, and actually now even in Latin America, and sometimes I feel maybe I'll give some advice, and I remind myself, wait a minute, the advice that I would give would be based upon how I did it. And by the way, things have changed dramatically since I left. I believe leaders, rather than going back to the well on the strategies that have worked for them, the challenge for leaders is to reinvest in themselves specific to finding new strategies. I think the one reason that leaders are dying on a vine is because they are relying on these strategies that used to work, strategies that I used to use, that I don't think would be effective right now. Right.
And it's so hard, right? Not to default to that.
It's so hard. It's not only is it muscle memory, but it's what we've watched and observed. Even just a decade ago, we would watch a leader and think, that's impressive. I don't think a leader 10 years ago would necessarily, of course, certain things would translate, but not all of it. And especially not in this, politically, fractioned world. So that we're in right now. We got to come up with some new strategies. So,
anyway. And I think that's part of the value in what, I guess, in our different ways, both of us are trying to do is kind of find those strategies and share them more widely. Because part of the problem is we don't have enough models for this, right? Like, how do you create functional conflict in a dysfunctional time? Like, we don't have enough storytelling around that. And this is something we keep urging journalists to do more of. Like, show us what is not broken and figure out, investigate, just like you would investigate Watergate, why, what happened here? And what can the rest of us learn from this? Because you're right, there's a default to the norm and it just doesn't work right now for a bunch of reasons. But part of it is under stress, it's really hard to do new things and take risks, right? So you have to have a way to practice that in a low stakes environment before you go out and take it on the road.
So I just thought of a new question I'm going to ask you, but before I do, I need to pause for a quick break. I'm going to throw this back to our producer, Chris. Chris, you have some brief words for us, so off to you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Richard, and I'm the producer of the Leader Chat with Jeff Rose podcast, brought to you by Cognia. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't done so already, please make sure you follow or subscribe to us if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or Podbean to make sure you're getting all the latest updates on the newest episodes. You can also check out our video episodes under our Cognia YouTube channel. Please make sure you check those out and leave us a like or a comment and let us know how we're doing. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Back to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, we're back. So this is a question I have. You mentioned earlier that we notice there's a lot of exhaustion. There's a lot of stress and anxiety just in education right now for all the reasons we've already described. The emotional toll that conflict takes on leaders, because number one, it's stressful and it's challenging and we don't always know the answers, which creates, once again, more anxiety when you don't know the answer and you're expected to know the answer. Being 10% vulnerable is a great strategy. As you know, it's probably easier said than done. And then leaders in the meantime not only take on the tension of the work, but they take on sometimes the tension and anxiety of others amidst this kind of chaotic and conflict-filled environment. So what are you seeing in terms of strategies that through this emotional burden that leaders can employ in order to remain resilient and avoid becoming overwhelmed on these adult-centric issues?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about a couple of them. One is to ask for help, not assume you are always the one, right? Another is to find or create communities of other leaders. That's something that we're trying to do at Good Conflict, is create a safe, confidential space for other leaders to trade ideas, right? Or at least commiserate and support each other. So it's because conflict can be so lonely, it can be so isolating. And it feels, when it's happening to you, like it's unique. Like it's just you. I was just talking to a leader in a very difficult spot right now. And he was saying how, although he's read my book and we've had lots of conversations, it really feels like his thing is different. We laughed about it because that's how it always feels, right? When you're in the hot seat. And there are important differences from one situation to the next, but recognizing the universality of high conflict. The conflict is something that happens, and there's different kinds of conflict. And it's really important to know the difference and to try to cultivate good conflict on purpose, recognizing the 4 accelerants that lead conflict to become poisonous. Those things are really, really helpful so that you have some vocabulary and names for the thing, that you maybe felt but didn't have words for, so that you feel, okay, this is not unique to me. I'm not alone. And there are some strategies out there. And not all of them are going to work for everyone, right? But just kind of widening the lens on the conflict is such a relief. It's such a relief.
We do these things for our members that we call it a solution circle, and basically it's a process. There's a protocol that aligns to this consultancy model that we've adapted and adjusted specific for leaders. And if a person is a member of the leadership circle, when they have a dilemma, it can be anything. And by the way, usually there are these kind of gray, politically sensitive issues, or sometimes there's it's based upon. It's always based upon adults to adults. Never does anyone ever say, I have a problem when it comes to kids. That being said, what we notice in this trend, and we've been doing this for years, is we have a really hard time convincing leaders to ask for help. But when they do, this is intriguing. When somebody submits, and we have this process, they submit their dilemma, and we do this online. It comes to us almost like a work order. We scrub it, take the name off, and we push it out to members throughout the country based upon the request of the person. So they could say a position alike, or I want this from only other small rural districts, and they push it out. And then as soon as we push it out and say, next Tuesday, because we can do this quickly, next Tuesday we have a solution circle and here's the dilemma, within an hour it fills up.
Amazing.
Every time.
I love this.
Every time. So
Really?
within an hour, people want to sign up to help other leaders through these sticky situations. And then we have to twist their arms and remind them, and sometimes even say, look, we know you have a problem, ask for help. Isn't that interesting? And then why do you think that may be the case, especially when they're in the thick of controversy?
So you're saying clearly people need help,
Yes.
and other people are very eager to give help that's super targeted and relevant. And yet there's this real hesitation to ask for help. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
What's interesting is that the people who sign up to help, it's not always because they have the answer. They may read the summary of, oh, this is the dilemma that we're signing up to help this leader with. In some ways, they're signing up because they too want to learn through the advising process. And they
Yeah.
end up in this kind of reciprocal relationship with everyone in the room,
Yeah.
right? And so it's fascinating to watch the behaviors of leaders. So the asking for help that you mentioned as a really key strategy, I think is dead on. And somehow, some way, we need to make that almost a norm and an expectation for leaders to do. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Absolutely. And I wonder if, now I'm kind of getting in the weeds with you here, but I can't help but wonder if, the more storytelling we can do around what this looks like. I mean, this is how the brain is a story processing machine, as my friend Jonathan Haidt once said. And that I can't ever forget that. It's easy to forget it, right? We can come up with all kinds of guidelines and instructions and lessons learned and blah, blah, blah. But stories are what matter. So can we tell stories around, the leader who did ask for help on your solution circle, and maybe, we have an audio clip of her anonymously or not saying, I did not want to ask for help. Here's why I did. I'm so glad I did. Like, the more stories we can tell around this, then the more we can broaden each other's imagination. And I mention that because your solution circle with the protocol that I love reminds me a lot from my own profession of journalism. There's a nonprofit called the Solutions Journalism Network that has trained tens of thousands of journalists around the world now to cover solutions, communities attempting to solve problems, not just the problem. And this is very counter to the journalism I grew up in. We just focused on problems and terrible things, and we left people to marinate in sadness and despair, which it's wrong, it was a mistake. But I think this is a similar way in which we're trying to get people out of that mindset and show them what a response looks like. And even if it doesn't work perfectly, in solutions journalism, often, it's not an easy fix because we're talking about like homelessness or, cancer or something. These are hard problems, right?
Yeah.
But rigorously reporting out a story about a community trying to respond to a problem, warts and all, makes all of us feel like a bunch of things at once. One, a little bit of hope, which we know we need biologically. And I don't think journalism has traditionally appreciated that. And also, it makes us ask, wait, if Houston is doing this and they've moved 20,000 people into houses, why isn't my mayor in, Denver or Washington doing this? And so it has a way in which it pushes accountability, even in the places it's not happening. And we know that audiences will engage with it. So anyway, I'm getting carried away. But I love the idea of the solution circle. And I think the more we can tell stories of great leaders asking for help, the more they will ask for help.
Well, it's good advice even for us, because this is something that we're constantly. I want to somehow change the game as it relates to educational leaders serving themselves and their own development, right? I think that's happening less and less. And I think that's a problem, especially during these, challenging times. And I think one way to do that is, create these circles and really focus discourse where leaders are helping each other, right?
Yeah, I think that having a structure for it is really smart. And I guess I wonder, do you think some of this is because we don't have a peer culture of watching each other teach and lead? Like that's not something that most American schools, teachers are still often in isolation, right? I mean, that's at least been my experience. And I was just with 300 teachers in Massachusetts this week, and they said the same thing, that, they don't talk to each other. It's considered, as this one teacher put it, pornographic to go watch someone else teach. Like it's just, forbidden. And that, of course, is going to create a culture potentially where you're not supposed to ask for help, right?
Yeah, I think education has had a hard time kind of breaking through the ceiling despite many, many attempts. And long time ago, my dissertation actually was on the impact of collaborative systems amongst educators and the impact that has on student results. And there have been all of these strategies over time, over the past, 2 to 3 decades. Some may go, those are PLCs, professional learning communities. That was kind of this named acronym, but there's been all these collaborative processes, but it's almost and sometimes that's really, really helpful, but the culture of education often is closing my door, I'm going to do the best I can, right? And sadly, what we've seen in education is even when a leader supports collaborative systems and pushes them into classrooms and says, we're going to collaborate, that doesn't mean that the leader's collaborative. So the leader may believe in collaboration, but when it comes to the practice of, deprivatizing what they do, being vulnerable with other peers, asking for help and support, looking for ways to be observed and specific to their performance, those things somehow leaders shy away from, not because they're bad people. I think they're conditioned. Right? And that conditioning of rising within a system, right, makes it really hard to be vulnerable and ask for help. So
it's counter to the very things that help you rise through a system.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly,
and so
right.
Collaboration is great as long as it's for other people, not for me, right?
That's right.
And the more politicized and explosive things get, obviously, the less likely you are to want to open up and invite people to the table and show what you're struggling with. So
I'm curious, in divisive times, and you've talked about it. What's fun about this for me, Amanda, is that originally we were talking specifically about high conflict. In the meantime, I've become kind of a fan of your content, and so not only have I have read more, but I get pinged when I see that you're on a particular podcast, and I go listen to that. So I now feel like I know not just high conflict, but other perspectives that you have shared, over years as well. So I'm curious, in divisive times like these, relationships, as you have described, can either be a source of conflict or a pathway, to resolution. And so I'm curious, how can leaders foster meaningful relationships? You think that support problem solving, collaboration, how do they leverage relationships to do that, as opposed to sometimes what we see? Relationships are hard because it's such a political world. Even the people they're closest to, they don't want to be honest with because they're close to them. If they're close, they worry, nobody tells nobody, word can get out, and then I'm in trouble. So do you have any thoughts on how a leader leverages relationships to create safety in order to find some new strategies on navigating conflict?
I was just meeting with a former superintendent of a city with a lot of conflict over education, and her former nemesis from the local school board. So the superintendent had told me that this was her nemesis. Her nemesis got elected to the school board, and then her nemesis became chair of the school board. And then over a series of months, they became partners. Like they really grew to work together, to collaborate and respect each other. So of course I was like, how did that happen? So to their great credit, right? This is the storytelling piece. They agreed to meet with me and talk about this. And lots of things happened, but some of the things that I think are replicable is that the superintendent never gave up on anyone, including this school board member. So they had some beef between each other that had to do with the firing of a principal and, other things. And then she ran for school board partly because of that beef, right? And so they had like plenty of history. But then the superintendent actively worked against this member becoming chair of the school board, right? Very vocally. And then she did. She was elected chair of the school board, right? So this is set up for disaster, right?
Yes, and I'm getting goosebumps out of fear because of this, right? This is not
right.
good.
Meanwhile, it's the pandemic, right? So everything is, it's just, nothing is looking promising here. And when that day she got elected, the superintendent sent her flowers. And now you might think, oh, that sounds phony. It sounds contrived. It sounds manipulative, whatever. And you know what? The school board member just said, I was surprised, but it got my attention, And I asked the superintendent, why did you do that? Was it intentional? Were you trying to manipulate? And she said, look, I do that with everybody. I just don't give up on people. And does that work 100% of the time? No, but it was step one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then another thing that happened soon after is that the school board member told the superintendent that she felt like the school board needed some training. Like they didn't know what was actually in their purview and what was not, what was actually their job and what was not. And the superintendent said, absolutely. And like that day, she gave them some options for training and they got it done, right? So she found small wins. Now, obviously, that's a win that's in everyone's interest.
Sure.
But when you can deliver small wins, and this is true, by the way, in violent conflict as well, you want to find the small wins. And all of this, though, requires not giving up on people, and it requires listening to people in ways they can see, and it requires asking them different questions. So it's not easy, and it can sound kind of saccharine. Oh, send flowers, and I think we both know that it's more complicated than that.
Sure,
but I think the relationship building has to ideally starts early and never stops, even when you have good reason to give up on someone.
Well, it's the sentiment of sending the flowers and what that represented, which is kind of this kickoff to this new relationship clearly that was established as opposed to relying on the old one that they had, right? So,
yeah, like a reset, yeah.
Yeah, a reset. Okay, so you're going to be here, we're recruiting these 30 teams that are coming. Team as the superintendent or the person responsible as the administrator of the system, and a board chair. They'll be coming together. Right.
Great.
And there's 30 teams from all over the country. We're looking at diversity in the room, so small systems, large, charter, independent, a variety of systems. But the concept is you got the chair of the governance team and the superintendent or the president or CEO of the organization here to learn together. At times they'll be working with other, in a like work, but at times they'll be talking with you. And of course, they're talking with you about this topic of course, kind of leading during challenging times. So knowing that we're kind of headed into that, just a few months from now, what would you hope that people take away from that experience?
Well, first of all, I'm so excited because often, you get to talk to like big groups of people, which is awesome, right? But they don't get to talk back always, and it's kind of unsatisfying. So I love that we get to really kind of wrestle with some things, and that the whole team is like you have teams coming. That's awesome. I hope that they take away some counterintuitive moves that they can use immediately in any conflict or potential conflict they are in, because I have found again and again and again that any intuitive thing you do in this moment of conflict will probably make things worse. And so you have to do counterintuitive things. And we at Good Conflict have been collecting the counterintuitive moves, right? And we want to collect more of them. So we are very interested. And we want to know how we can operationalize those things and make them easier for folks so they aren't so difficult. But those are the things that can suddenly bring you a sense of hope, where it felt, it often feels in conflict like a trap, like there's no way out, there's no oxygen. And doing something that is surprising to everyone else involved in the conflict can create just enough space to change that.
So As I was mentioning before, Amanda, most of our systems and structures, even when you will be here with our members, are roundtable processes, right? Our motto is circles are better than rows. We have these systems where leaders are helping leaders through these kind of protocols and facilitators. This is the one thing that we do in our leader chat that's kind of pushed out content. But if you were to imagine, whether maybe you imagine when you're with us in January, and we're around a table, and with us are superintendents, principals, and every other position in between. So educational leaders. Right now, based upon where we are in this week, this month, and what we predict is coming, what would be your final piece of advice? So kind of the drop the mic, 30 seconds. This is my final words of recommendations for you to think about as a leader. Ready, go.
You cannot do this alone. And luckily, you don't have to. You need to find ways to practice counterintuitive moves in conflict in a low stakes setting with one another and with your team and with other people that can help you, because normal rules of engagement will not work right now.
Amanda, I have one thing I probably have the best job in that I get to be exposed to wise people like yourself, and then not only be exposed and engage, I create these people that I'm fans of, and I get to follow and read and listen to, and so I want you to know that you have made a difference in the way I think about conflict. I love the fact that you named your organization Good Conflict. I think that's a stellar name. Well done. Because I think it's important that we think about conflict like that, as opposed to how do we run away from it? How do we lean into it? Because if leaders don't, who will? So I just want to thank you for everything that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think the timing as well as the topic makes it obvious as to why we invited this expert on conflict, Amanda Ripley. And by the way, it's not just conflict. If you follow and read what Amanda has written, you will see the kind of breadth of perspective that she brings to us, especially in the space of being educational leaders. I'm so thankful for this conversation. I have to assume that this has been helpful for you to listen to. Ladies, gentlemen, educators, leaders, be well.